So with that, it is my distinct honor and pleasure to welcome somebody that I think is phenomenal. I have seen him in a variety of contexts. In fact, I think I met him more like 10 years ago at the urging of my parents who were active in the NAACP and met this guy. They said, his name is Jeff Johnson. You should meet him. Just whatever you do, just structure a meeting to meet him. And so I was so curious that I decided to ask him out for coffee. And I was impressed. And since then, we've been on panel after panel after panel. I have seen this brother talk about housing. I've seen this brother talk about education. I've seen him talk about income security. I've seen him talk about health with the knowledge of a policy expert. And he doesn't claim to be that. But he has that kind of grasp and depth on the issues while also being able to bring it down to the level of the everyday ordinary person. He can translate these complex issues in a way that people understand. So it's my very distinct honor and pleasure to introduce you to Jeff Johnson. He is an award-winning journalist, social activist, political commentator, and author. He is an MSNBC contributor and the executive editor of Politics365.com. He's also the weekly commentator on the nationally syndicated Tom Joyner Morning Show, tackling issues related to politics, entertainment, and social policy issues. Johnson is also currently the chairman and CEO of the Jeff Johnson Institute for Urban Development, a solutions-focused institution currently leading a 5-year project to recruit and develop 80,000 Black male teachers. So with that, let's welcome Jeff Johnson to the podium.
Good morning. We need you to be a little bit more spirited than that. Good morning. That's much better. It is an honor and a privilege to be here. Thank you, Maya, all those associated with Insight and putting this event together, for allowing me to participate. I think Maya framed the conversation well, and we want to dive right into it. We have a panel of brilliant folks. But what I think is interesting as we even dive into this discussion is, as we talk really around what happened in this election that made folks who seemingly had forgotten that this was a country of color, that there were people of color. And more importantly than that, because I think this is something that the commentators have not dived into very well, is who moved those communities and how those individuals who move those communities are going to be involved in some of the negotiation that I think Maya spoke to. Much of the reporting that you would hear post-election, if you're not critical, would lead you to believe that the Obama campaign was more brilliant than they actually are, and was able to reach pockets that they did not know how to reach and did not have the capability to reach. That does not take away the sophistication of their campaign, nor does it take away the brilliance in which the campaign was run. What it does do is it minimizes people at the ground level who were intricately involved in going places that neither campaign knew how to go, with messages that neither campaign knew how to communicate, with tried and true mechanisms, both old and new, to be able to mobilize people, not just excite them. And especially when you look at the state of Ohio, where you saw 2% larger African-American turnout in 2012 than you did in 2008, with an electorate that was less excited, that was not engaged in a history-making apparatus. And if you would have asked most pollsters leading up to Election Day, were not necessarily excited about the election, but they were soberly committed. That means that somebody moved them. And so when we start talking about what happened, it's going to be key for us as we transition into the what's next, being very clear about who the players are, who they need to be, what are the institutions that are available to us, and how must they be engaged in this process, so that we're talking about progressive movement and not antiquated movement. And with that, I would like to bring our panel forward, Christine Chen, who is with APAI Vote. Thank you. Please give her a round of applause as she comes. Tiffany Smalley, who is with NCAI. Julie Martinez Ortega with PowerPack.org. And Margie Omero with Momentum Analysis. And as we begin to prepare Christine's presentation, each will give a 5-minute presentation, at which time we will go into questions that I engage the panel with, and at that point we will open up the floor for you all to be able to engage the panel.
Okay, I guess I'll go first. So, I wanted to talk, thank you so much for having me here. This is really a great event, and I follow Dr. Rocky Moore anywhere. Is the volume? Push the button. Okay, push the button. Normally I'm not asked to speak up louder, but maybe there's a first for everything. So a few key points about the election. I'm a Democratic pollster. I follow and I blog about gender and polling issues at Huffington Post before when I was at pollster.com and now Huffington Post. And so I have a few thoughts based on the exit polls and the coverage. First is obviously, as everyone here has probably heard, there has been a lot of talk about the composition of the electorate. And what I think there's a few facts just so we're all on the same page of what that means. So the first is the Romney campaign, you may have heard say quite a bit even before the election, they were assuming that the percentage of the electorate that was white would be unchanged from 2008. Their argument was, and I understand the argument was, this was historic minority turnout, and that's just simply not going to happen again. The counter argument is the percentage of the electorate that is white has dropped every single election since 1992. And it seemed unlikely that this year that would change. So it turned out that the counter argument was true and the Romney campaign assumption was incorrect. And that was part of what happened. It was certainly part of the narrative of what's happened after the fact. But there's a couple other pieces to it. The other thing that you may hear sometimes in the post-game spin is that when people talk about the gender gap, that's really more of an issue with minority voters. It's not really an issue with white voters because white women voted for Romney by 14 points. You may have heard some, Republicans talk about that. But actually, the gender gap increased from 2008 across all racial lines. So there was a smaller gender gap among white voters, among black voters, among Latino voters in 2008 than there was now. So there's a few things that are happening that all worked against the Romney campaign. One was the changing composition of the electorate, and two is a widening of the gender gap, and three was some difficulty for him in states where he wouldn't have issues with minority turnout, such as New Hampshire and Iowa, which he still ended up falling short. So I think all of those things worked against Mitt Romney. He had a narrower path in terms of message and in terms of the map. And that led him to be in a place where I think he was trying to really run up the score with white men, finding himself with difficulty with all other groups, running up the score with white men. And that's why you see so much reliance on things that seem racially coded, such as, talk about food stamps and welfare. And the misleading ads that I'm sure folks here remember from the end of the summer and the beginning of the fall. And so here is why I think that's also important. It's because in 2008, we obviously tested our boundaries of what kind of language is appropriate when we're talking about women candidates for president and vice president, or when we're talking about an African-American candidate for president, right? We explored, and we didn't all come to a consensus, right, on what language is appropriate, but we had those conversations, and we continue to have those conversations this time around with President Obama and language. Is John Sununu, is that a dog whistle, or is he just, that's just how he talks, is that, and so we had that kind of conversation. But we also had a conversation this time around about how do we talk about minority voters, or how do we talk about women voters? That's a little bit different than the conversation we had in 2008. So when you have Paul Ryan say, well, we didn't realize how we would do, the urban turnout really hurt us. It's not that the word urban is pejorative. It's the sense that somehow the results are invalidated because it came from, because there was a larger, because so much of Obama's vote share came from minority voters, that somehow that makes the results not valid. And that's the tone that sounds like to me, and I'm sure it strikes other people the same way. And so I think that's part of what we're seeing coming out of this electorate, that I think Republicans and Democrats, we're all going to, and the press really need to figure out what kind of tone is appropriate. And that's also true when we're talking about issues such as income inequality or government assistance for food. It's something that I think could have gotten even more play when you have folks, when you have Romney's secret comment saying half of the electorate feels entitled to food, of all things. It's like saying they're entitled to air. How dare they be entitled to air or food? And Paul Ryan and the makers and takers and all of that language that I think is something that we need to, and I know I'm running out of time so we can get back to it with the questions, but it's something that I think is important for us to find a language here in Washington that is inclusive, that doesn't strike voters as racially coded, because even if it's not expressed that way, I know from in focus groups, it can be internalized that way.
Thank you. Julie, please.
All right. Excuse me. So we can now say that Latinos have decisively entered the national electoral arena as a powerful voting bloc. The sleeping giant, all the sort of different ways that Latinos have been referenced in the past can really be set aside, I think, quite clearly at this point. We finally hit the double digits and reached a full 10% share of all voters nationwide. Not only have Latinos increased our numerical representation among all voters, we're becoming more progressive over time. And this year, Latinos gave 71% of their vote to the Democratic presidential candidate, which is the highest support since Clinton won 72% of the vote back in 1996. And it's important to note that while these numbers may seem impressive, we're still lagging far behind our potential when it comes to electoral performance. For example, while we comprise 10% of the voters by casting 12.7 million ballots this year, there were actually 24 million of us who were eligible to vote. In other words, just over half of us voted, and about 11 million sat out this critical election year. Among those Latinos who did vote, in some states we saw steep increases in their preference for more progressive candidates. Colorado and Arizona each made very significant jumps from their 2008 levels in terms of voting for Democrats as opposed to Republicans. In Colorado, they went from 61% voting for the progressive candidate for president in 2008 to 75% in 2012. And in Arizona, they went from 56% in 2008 to 74% in 2012. Of course, Arizona is still not completely finished counting, with at least not in Maricopa County. But in other states, we saw the progressive to conservative split remaining steady among Latinos and even dropping. For example, in California, New Mexico, and Nevada, Latinos dropped 4, 5, and 6 points, respectively. And these differences highlight that a one-size-fits-all analysis of the 2012 vote doesn't really make sense when we're talking about Latinos, at least not at the national level. And similarly, there's no one-size-fits-all way to organize and to engage the Latino vote, if there is a Latino vote. Where we do see some signs, though, of shared experience and homogeneity among Latinos is in the heightened sense of hostility directed toward them that they seem to be experiencing across states and across national origin groups. And this phenomenon mirrors earlier research done over the past few years, pretty much since the immigration debate has heated up once again. Much of this reported hostility is a result of thinly veiled anti-Latino and somewhat xenophobic sentiments packaged as anti-immigrant or we are a country of laws rhetoric. In other words, Latinos of all stripes, races, immigration statuses know that the same people who want to make U.S. society so inhospitable to Latino immigrants that they're forced to leave or self-deport also would like for the rest of us to leave. In this way, the immigration issue takes on special salience for Latinos that may be distinct from its meaning among other race and ethnic groups. However, a careful reading of the surveys conducted over the past year and even those in the past week and a half or so on Latino voters does not indicate that passage of immigration reform legislation per se is the golden key to winning over the Latino vote. And certainly ceasing the anti-Latino hostility that surrounds the immigration debate is a necessary first step. But merely passing immigration reform will not be enough. Serious policy fixes to the jobs crisis that's disproportionately impacting Latinos is necessary, as is opening up wider opportunities for quality education at all levels to Latinos. And these two issues, jobs and education, are the ones that really pop out and that enjoy widespread support among all Latino groups and in different parts of the country. Fixing these problems and opening up opportunities in these key areas will be critical to building a permanent majority based on the growing Latino vote. And one last comment about what we're seeing in this year's election results. Places where investments and appropriate efforts have been made over the past several years, such as in California, Colorado, and now Arizona, are starting to bear fruit. For example, these states had pre-existing civic engagement working groups in place well before the campaigns went into full swing. So they didn't lose time organizing themselves and establishing trust among the various groups that were going to be working together for the election. Serious research on these states' Latino voters began back in the spring of this year, allowing for advocates to be up on the air by late May with ads defining the conservative candidates and beating the conservatives to the punch so that by the time their ads hit, our core voters were already inoculated against their messages. By not ceding any ground and by contesting any attempts to win over Latino voters to the conservative messages, both at the doors and on the air, we were able to hold the line and keep Latino voters engaged up through Election Day, despite an onslaught of voter suppression directed against them. Organizers did this by integrating electoral messages with policy issues that had deep resonance for these voters, and that really was derived from that research that was done. We all know that this sort of work takes months and even years to carry out, and it cannot be done 3 weeks before the voter registration deadline hits. But when organizers have the resources to run year-round efforts, they appear to be succeeding big time. Moreover, they're able to reach not only the likely Latino voters, but the mid and low propensity Latino voters as well. And oddly enough, research indicates quite clearly that these are the voters most likely to be with us on progressive issues. Thank you.
I have a PowerPoint. Is it, oh, okay. I thought, a little confused. Good morning, everyone. I just want you to look at these images here. They're both widely recognized images from this country's history. And I first want to draw your attention to the bundle of arrows in the eagle's talons. Those arrows are a symbol of the great, or is it? Oh. These are the pictures I was talking about. Those arrows are a symbol of the Great Iroquois Confederacy, which actually had a profound influence on the outcome of the Revolutionary War and the origins of American democracy. In 1776, the Iroquois chiefs were invited to the Continental Congress, and they spoke about their confederacy and shared the hope that new Americans would act as one people and have but one heart. While tribal nations are an important part of the important part of and a large inspiration for this country's democratic system, up until the 1970s, many state constitutions continued to pose barriers to Native voter participation. When war heroes returned from the Second World War, men like Ira Hayes, who raised the flag at Iwo Jima, he's the man farthest to the right in this picture, which is a very iconic picture, they were denied the right to vote in their home states. So NCI has fought since 1944 to ensure that American Indians and Alaska Native citizens are afforded equal rights to a system that they themselves thought of long before the United States was even founded. So just to fast forward a little, Native Vote 2012 this year, we had 18 key states, and you'll see from the map that they aren't your usual battleground states. This is very much related to the bipartisan nature of Indian country, and these are primarily states with high Native populations, but also states where key races took place this election, where Indian country will likely forge crucial partnerships in the years to come. And while our focus is on these 18 states, we've worked throughout all of Indian country to revitalize civic participation, and that's the focus of our campaign. As such, the foundation of this work is local action in Native communities. For example, during Native Vote Action Week, which took place the last week of September, over 140 events took place, reaching more than 35,000 people throughout Indian country. So building infrastructure and inspiring participation are both things we can't do overnight, as everyone knows. And every cycle, you'll see races that no one ever expected to be competitive. The parties weren't always ready, but our Native communities were ready. So there are some key outcomes that emerged from this year's election, and I'm just going to highlight a couple. First, I want to highlight Indian Country's bipartisan presence opportunity. The media is currently talking about Indian Country's support for the re-election of Jon Tester in Montana and Heidi Heitkamp in North Dakota, Senator-elect Heidi Heitkamp. And Heitkamp is a former state attorney general that had a track record of working with tribal nations, she fought for Indian Country. And in the end, she won by 2,994 votes, with a margin of more than 4,000 coming from North Dakota's Indian reservations. It's critical to remember that just 2 years ago, though, we were talking about the unlikely re-election of Alaska Senator Lisa Murkowski, a common sense moderate Republican who won a historic write-in campaign thanks to the Native vote. So Native voters don't merely vote D for Democrat or R for Republican, they vote I for Indian. Also this year, Tom Cole, a citizen of the Chickasaw Nation of Oklahoma, is now joined by, in the House of Representatives by Mark Wayne Mullen, an enrolled member of the Cherokee Nation, which now brings us to 2 enrolled Native members of the U.S. Congress, both members of the Republican Party. So there's a clear roadmap for members of both parties to engage in Indian Country, and these are all shining examples of bipartisan opportunity. Lastly, this year, as we all know, voter IDs were a big issue. Our campaign raised awareness about some states of concern where IDs were required, but tribal IDs were not accepted, such as Alaska and Florida. And we have taken a stance against these proposed and existing voter ID laws. A positive outcome came from the vote on Minnesota's ballot measure Amendment 2 that would have required photo ID, likely excluding tribal IDs. As you can see from the slide, precincts with larger Native populations voted against the law at a rate of 10 points higher than the rest of the state. The largest Native district actually voted 86% against the amendment. So we see in places where access to the polls is not restricted, people make their voice heard. In Minnesota, a state with same-day registration, Native people made their voice heard. In North Dakota, in a state with no registration at all, we changed a Senate outcome. Indian Country turned out to make a difference in this election, and we're really looking forward to the future beyond 2012 and even beyond 2014 to continue to revitalize civic engagement. And as the people who inspired American democracy, we want to see it grow and thrive, and we look forward to working with you to do just that. Thank you.
Great. Good morning, everyone. My name is Christine Chen, and I'm actually with Asian and Pacific American Vote. There's a slight typo, APAI Vote for short. Starting in 2010, when many of the national and local nonprofit organizations started to work on Census 2010, we recognized with the growth of our community that 2012 would actually be a very important election. We are the fastest racial group with where 35 states had 50% or more of a growth rate, where overall our population is about 17 million. And with that, 1 in 4 congressional districts, as well as 600 cities and municipalities, have a Asian American Pacific Islander population of 5% or more. But this actually encompasses a wide variety and diversity within our community, where we actually represent at least 50 different ethnicities. And 2/3 of our community are first-generation immigrants, but yet we also have a high naturalization rate of 58%. Going into this election, traditionally what we also found was that the media and the polls typically would actually put Asian American Pacific Islanders in the other category. So what happened was that a lot of different national organizations, we went ahead and were able to secure some resources to actually conduct a wide variety of different polling, as you can see. The first 2 columns, there's actually a poll that was conducted by APAI Vote, Asian American Justice Center, Asian American Institute, actually back in April. And then the middle columns were polling that was done from July to October with the National Asian American Survey. And then the last two polls were one with ALDEF and National Capacity, which was a election Eve poll, and then of course we have the national statistics from the National Election Pool. But what you also see is like early on, Asian American Pacific Islanders were actually undecided. Even though we were heading towards supporting Obama, he actually had a larger percentage, a large majority still really early on did not understand or really know who Romney was or who was that candidate. And as time went on, the Obama campaign was able to capture more of our community. And ultimately, we had, as stated in the National Election Pool, of 73% going for Obama with 26% going for Romney. In the same, with some of the same polls, we also were able to ask in a generic congressional vote choice, would you go for the Democrat or the Republican? Once again, the Democrats were doing a lot better, but once again, we also saw a 31% of an undecided vote. Also, in terms of party identification, the community typically doesn't necessarily see themselves as a Democrat or a Republican or a progressive or conservative. It's really about the issues and the relationships that a particular candidate actually has with their local community. But throughout the years, the Democrats have been actually making a lot more headway, as you see in terms of these different polls, in terms of their support, in terms of party identification. Part of that I've also seen, I think this is like my 5th presidential election cycle, is that in the last 20 years, we've seen a lot more Asian American Pacific Islanders run for office, and their majority are Democrats. And then as a result, there's been more of an infrastructure building on the Democratic and the progressive side of things. And then in terms of issues, as we can see, Asian American Pacific Islanders also ranked very highly that the economy in general was one of their top issues. But when you really look and dig deeper in terms of these issues, it will actually, the topic of the economy will actually differ in terms of the details, depending on if you're talking to a Filipino American or a South Asian or a Chinese or someone who's Hmong. For instance, Korean Americans have the highest insurance rate of uninsured rate of 22%. So healthcare and Obamacare actually resonated really well with some portions of the Asian American Pacific Islander community. And then the other part that I really wanted to emphasize is that many times throughout the election season, where the AAPI community has been left out of the discussion, is really about the margin of victory. So when you look at the first chart in terms of the margin of difference in terms of the race, you look at Nevada and Virginia, and this was actually the margin of difference for this election. But you have the Asian American Pacific Islander citizen voting age population of over 122,000 and 227,000 in Virginia. So this only proves and demonstrates that, once again, that the Asian American Pacific Islanders is a definite part of the new diverse communities of voters that are out there that they need to pay attention. The second chart is actually some of the key states where the margin of difference in the presidential race was also really quite close. In Ohio, where you typically don't think of Asian American Pacific Islanders, we actually had about 5 different nonprofits working on a nonpartisan voter registration engagement program, where, especially when the election was really close with 103,000. Overall, I just wanted to really emphasize that this really was the largest mobilization effort of Asian American Pacific Islander nonprofits, of over 85 nonprofits in 20 states, ranging from the consortium that was built by the Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance, APAI Vote, National Capacity, and many others. And one other thing I want to flag is that also this was a year of many firsts for the Asian American Pacific Islander community. We had 25 of a historic 25 new candidates that were AAPI. 17 made it through their Democratic primary, and 3 of them made it through their Republican primary. And as a result, we actually have 6 additions to the Congressional APAI caucus, where we have Mazie Hirono, who's going to be our first Asian American and women of color in the Senate side. She's also the only Buddhist on the Senate. We also have Tulsi Gabbard, who is going to be, she's Hindi, and and also we have Tammy Duckworth, who is Thai and Chinese. So we're really excited to see this, and with that, I really look forward to the discussion.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you to each of you for your presentations, and we really do want to have a conversation. When you violently disagree with another member of the panel, please stand up and say so before we open the floor to the audience. But I do want to ask you, each of you talked a great deal about what some of your organizations did, but I'm very interested in how did the campaigns on both sides effectively engage your communities, and was there a level of satisfaction even on the Democratic side in how the party engaged your demographic? And Julie, we'll start with you.
I think in many ways, the Romney campaign, they were quite effective, unfortunately effective in many ways in getting people to not vote for them within the Latino community. So I think that in some ways really helped motivate a lot of Latinos to go out and vote, to make sure that that wasn't the sort of leadership we ended up having. It was actually...
was that a messaging issue?
I think it was messaging, and I think it was really ultimately about policy. I think when people looked at what a world under Romney would look like for themselves as Latinos, as people who, for the most part, Latinos have lower incomes on average than the mainstream population, lower education levels, and are really concerned about, making sure that their children will have a better life, right? When you look at a situation, where you might have a President Romney who wants to cut Pell Grants, right? Latinos use Pell Grants at really high rates. Opportunities to even enter college in the first place, jobs, that I think frightens people. And so I think there was a real turning away from that. I think that on the other side, for the Democrats, there was, I think each year it's gotten a bit better in terms of trying to really live up to a commitment to reaching out in a meaningful way to the Latino community. I think there's still a long way to go, of course, and I think that even for those of us who work closely within the communities, we still have to grapple with the question of what it means to organize recently naturalized Mexican Americans in Southern California, as opposed to Puerto Ricans who are by birthright citizens living on the East Coast, right? You can't really do all that with one plan.
And I definitely want to come back to you on that, but Tiffany, can you engage that as well, please?
Sure. So I would definitely say that both campaigns engaged on some level. We just had our annual conference in Sacramento, and representatives from both campaigns came and spoke to the membership, which is very representative of Indian country. And then, of course, President Obama has had the Tribal Leaders Summit every year since his first election, and which has been a very great way to engage with Indian country. But more definitely needs to be done, especially in light of the federal trust responsibility to tribes. So I think some was done, but more needs to be done.
Well, has there been with that engagement a feeling that there has been reciprocation from a policy standpoint, and what have been some of the policy wins?
Sure. So I know that our executive director will speak a little bit more about some of the policy implications for this later, but I know that the Indian Health Care Act and the Tribal Law and Order Act are two examples of things that have come forth. The Cobell settlement, which came out of the administration, was also a policy win. So I think there's been a significant amount of engagement, more engagement than has been in previous years. And it's been difficult in past years to get the attention of candidates and elected officials because of the small population. But as I had mentioned, the federal trust responsibility is something that we definitely always point to say that this is a responsibility that is built into the Constitution that the federal government has to uphold.
Great. Christine?
For the Asian American Pacific Islander community, I would say that a lot of the interaction and outreach was mostly done probably the last 2 months. It really wasn't done effectively in terms of early on. For instance, the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus and even members of our National Coalition of Asian Pacific Americans, which is a coalition of 30-some national civil rights organizations that are, many of them are based here in DC. They actually haven't had a chance to really interact with the president, meet with him early on to actually even discuss their own policy agendas. But ultimately, later on, we did find, at least in the battleground states, that there was some type of outreach done. Like, for instance, in Ohio, we actually saw the Romney campaign actually send in, or at least one of the PACs send in, translate Chinese lit to Chinese American voters, or to actually do robocalls to Chinese American voters in Virginia. On the Obama campaign, we actually saw them send in surrogates to do 15 events the last month in Ohio, or to actually have field organizers that were specifically Chinese, Vietnamese, and Korean in Virginia. So it's, in some ways we've seen movement, what we actually hadn't not seen in previous elections, but there's still a lot more that they could actually be doing.
Julie, I want to come to you, and Margie also, you as well. During the campaign, the actress, African-American actress, or at least of African descent actress, Stacey Dash, came out saying she was supporting Romney. And black folks went nuts. No, seriously, to the point where she got death threats, where she was seriously threatened physically because of her decision. No one asked why. It was just an onslaught immediately. And I'm often offended by the lack of complexity that we have even internally about how diverse we are as a community, politically and culturally. I want to ask you, because Julie, you mentioned about the shift to the left of the Latino vote in large. And so my question is that a reflection of a bloc going more left, or is it a more complex bloc? And how does that speak to what happened through this election? And then Margie, if you could follow up, because the reality is all of these groups, women included, are becoming more and more complex. And what is it going to take for these groups in particular to be able to communicate the complexity of their ideological positions? One, so that the fragmentation doesn't have to be so much that it tears the community up from the inside, and two, that you can create more effective coalitions, even internally. And I know that's a lot. So Julie, if you'd go first, and then Margie.
Well, I'd say two things. One is that we see the composition of different Latino subgroups shifting, right? So Cuban Americans now include, a significant chunk of people who lived in Cuba, were raised under, a Castro regime, who are here living in the U.S. now. They have a different perspective than people who fled that initially and, have lived in the U.S. for, a good 20, 30, 40 years for something, right? And so we see some changes happening just within the groups themselves. I think you also see, as the voter engagement efforts sort of get fully online and are really functioning at a higher level, you see this ability of the organizations to really bring out previously disengaged Latino voters who, in a lot of the survey work that's been done to date, all indications are that they actually are more progressive than their voting counterparts, right? Holding all other things constant, national origin, generation, whatnot. And so the more those people are able to be brought in, I think you're going to actually see a more progressive Latino vote overall. Now, that work tends to be happening primarily among the Mexican-American population, which is also the segment within the Latino groups that's growing the fastest, right? And so I think that actually will, in some ways, propel that shift to happen even more quickly.
Margie.
So I think there are a few things to note. First, with Latinos specifically, I mean, obviously Julie can speak more to the complexity in the community, but looking at the exit polls, in 2004, Bush got to the 44% of the Latino vote. Now that's seen as a high watermark, and and say what you like about George W. Bush, I mean that was something that where he was more to the more in the middle than the rest of his party, and that was his record in Texas as well. So that's seen as a high watermark, and there was a conventional wisdom among Republicans that they need 40% among Latinos to win, and that was back then, as obviously before the community continued to grow. John McCain, again, someone with a little bit more of a moderate record than other folks in the party, got 31% of the Latino vote in an election where he was just not going to win. I mean, it was just, there were just too many obstacles for him. Mitt Romney got 27% of the Latino vote. Now, and that was true the entire election year. All year, if you look at the polls, he was underperforming the whole time. He was getting 14, 19% in some polls early on in the year. I rarely saw him break 30 in any public poll, so it wasn't a surprise that he underperformed McCain. And here's why. In the primary, he just wanted to get out of that primary, and that was his one issue where he could really pivot to the right of the rest of the primary field to really stake a far-right position. And I think that really hurt him. He was never really able to overcome. And then on top of that, not being able to have a real sense of where he was on the DREAM Act and Obama's revised deporting DREAM-eligible young people and all of those kinds of issues where he just didn't really know exactly where he was and didn't have a clear position. I think all of that hurt him. In addition to changes in the Latino community, I think there's something specific about what happened in this election that continued that movement to the right. And obviously there is a lot of talk in the Republican Party about trying to reach out to Latinos. There are, quite a few Latino Republican elected officials that are working on that. So, my sense is that they're going to continue to have that internal dialogue. Now, as far as the thing that was Stacey, that example, I mean, I think that kind of thing is a little corrosive to our dialogue. I mean, I think it's a good thing. Look, I disagree with them, right? But it's fine with me when I see women who are running as Republicans who are not concerned about issues of gender. I just want, I'm happy to see more women running for office from all stripes. That's something that I think is it furthers the cause of women voters generally and women elected officials if they are coming from all different stripes. And
But that's really the point of the question. The point of the question is, internally, are you seeing groups having this kind of chess game discussion that says we can't put the majority of our support behind one party or another? There's value to a complexity of the electorate. It's better to play both sides of the field. Do you see leadership groups having that kind of effective discussion, and where they are on opposite sides of the aisle, still finding places to be able to intersect where it's mutually beneficial?
I mean, I can't speak to the leadership discussions, but I do know that when it comes to a lot of these issues, that ultimately voters see far less of a partisan breakout than the Washington dialogue. There are a lot of issues where Washington is far more partisan than voters, and I think there's some, we did, for example, let me give an example. We did a project, and I know this is not really an answer to your question, so I apologize, but I'm going
Well, you
a little
said
bit.
you couldn't answer it, so that's all right.
It's true. Slightly different direction. So we did a project on hunger, and we did groups with white women, and we did groups with African-American women, we did groups with Latino women about hunger generally, their own food, how they think about food, and also food assistance as a political issue. And while food assistance as a political issue is very partisan, when you are watching the ads and the discussion of the Romney ads and how that has been played out in some press outlets, when you were actually talking to women, there was not a whole lot of difference in the language that
upscale white women used versus an African American group versus a Latino group. Everybody had a shared, had a very similar way of looking at it, which is there was a lot of, there was a lot of abuse of this, but people need it, and kids shouldn't go hungry. I mean, that was sort of where everyone came down, with obviously some differences. So that's just an example of where Washington can use very political rhetoric, and there's a million other issues like that, where Washington uses very, very hot political rhetoric. Voters are less partisan. Immigration is another one where voters, who may be lean Republican, don't use some of the same hot rhetoric about immigrants because they are their neighbors, or they're people who work in their kids' school, or they're folks that they know from work. So so they don't have some of this hot language that you can sometimes see cable commentators and candidates for office and folks looking to increase their Twitter followership will use. So.
Let me do that. I want to ask two quick questions, and then I want to make sure that we open the floor to the audience so you can get engaged. Christine, I want to direct this to you. I talked earlier about the fact that many of us know that when we looked at the numbers, I don't think anyone expected some of the high rates of people of color to turn out, not necessarily who they were supporting, but them turning out. The story, I don't think, as I mentioned earlier, has been written about who was responsible for really turning those folks out. Does that become a potential problem moving forward, or is it used as a negotiating tool as we begin to even transition to the next conversation, which is what's next? Because you're not hearing the narrative of this group in this state, this group in this state was able to bump the president by 2 and 3 points. It was how fantastic the Obama campaign was. Does that create challenges when you begin to negotiate what some policy needs are and your ability to be able to say, wait a minute, we moved this demographic for you?
Right. I think that is an issue that we do need to go ahead and try to have those discussions with both parties and about the role of the nonprofits and the role of Asian American Pacific Islander organizations on the grassroots level as well as on the national level, who don't, like I said earlier, we don't resonate whether we're Democrat or Republican or progressive or conservative. It's really about the issues that we're advocating on. So many of the nonprofits we worked with, they were motivated because of the issues that they're trying to advocate on, whether it's about housing or jobs and economy or education or immigration. But that is what actually moved them to actually go and vote. Now, how they actually saw who actually had the better case or better message, that was obviously done not only by, I think, the Obama campaign, but also the surrounding organizations. There's a lot of Asian American Pacific Islander Democrats. There's a lot more political PACs that they actually had their own mechanisms to actually reach out to the communities, especially when they actually know that there was growth in Virginia and Nevada and Ohio and Colorado, and that they knew that specific messaging actually needed to be done there, versus I don't think the Obama campaign even recognized that early on.
Mm-hmm. Last question before we go, and Tiffany, if you would chime in on this, but all of you can if you're interested. Christine, you mentioned the number of seats picked up by Asian Pacific Islanders, and you look at African Americans picked up additional seats in the House. There was a growth of the number of women, obviously, in the Senate. So there was growth of marginalized minority groups across the board and down ballot. The question is, as we move forward, is there a training apparatus that exists, a feeder pool, if you will, that is being both talent scout and trainer to be able to change what down ballot candidates look like, and ultimately what potential congressional and senatorial, gubernatorial candidates look like, 10 years from now, 12 years from now? Are any of your groups actively engaged in institution-based talent search and training to be able to prepare not just candidates, because I don't think what we also don't talk about is campaign staff, campaign managers, finance directors, issues directors, so on and so forth, because so often when both parties at the federal level are looking for people of color, they always claim that they can't find them. So are any of your organizations working institutionally or know institutionally of that kind of work beginning to take place?
Sure, I'll just chime in on that. NCAI is actively a big part of our campaign this year, was working to ensure that more Natives run for office, for federal office, for local office, and state offices as well. There are a lot more Native leaders in the state level, but on the federal level, we only have 2 in Congress right now. So. This is definitely something that's a focus of the campaign moving forth, and we had a workshop for tribal leaders at our annual convention last year, and gearing up for this year's election cycle. But in a lot, their tribal leaders are understand how to run a campaign on the tribal level, but there's a lot more that goes into a federal campaign, and so moving forth, that's definitely something that NCAI is hoping to move forward on, yeah.
And I'll just jump in. For Power Pack, over the years, we've actually brought in social justice fellows and people that we basically take sort of early career and help train them in a lot of those skills that will enable them to go out and get jobs as strategists, operatives, people who are on that sort of campaign staff side, because we do think that's ultimately the place that we've got to really do a lot of development for people. We're right now very seriously looking at Texas and trying to think through what are the pieces of infrastructure, and a big part of that would be the people skills, right, that would be needed to actually realize the full potential of that demographic shift that's happening there, right, and to actually move a lot of those currently disengaged voters who are Latino, who, if you combine them with the Asian American population in Texas, with the progressive white population, with the African American population, are already the majority numerically of the electorate, right? So it's sort of a, there are a number of issues. One of them, I think, is finding the right staff people to come in and actually work those cases. We also have a PAC called PAC Plus, which I'm the president of, and we target specifically geographic areas where we believe that people of color and progressive whites in combination can make real changes, and we find candidates that really we think can motivate and speak to those people, and we had tremendous success in our first year out in 2012 with that. So I think more efforts really need to be carried out that way. And our thing is that from the donor side, we call ourselves a pack of many donors, not just mega donors. And the idea is that people of color and progressives actually have to start becoming donors as well. We may not be able to give $50,000 a year checks, but we can give a $50 check or a $500 check. Absolutely. In many cases.
And I hope we talk about that more in the next panel. Christine and Margie, I want to hold your comments for a moment, because what I want to do is be